Kick us off today. Please welcome to the stage the Senior Strategic Finance Manager, Dr. Shamika Walsh.
Good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Shamika Walsh, Senior Strategic Finance Manager here at UNCF in the Institute for Capacity Building, Strategic Finance Institute. So I want to reflect back over my time starting here at UNCF. I began during the pandemic in 2020 in October, and I've had the pleasure of working with the CFOs at our member institutions, and it's been awesome. So the Strategic Finance Institute focuses on partnering with the member institution CFOs to assist them and work with them on increasing their financial capacity and long-term financial sustainability. When I think of the CFOs at our member institutions, I think of them as the unsung heroes. And so when you also think of the department that they oversee, which is the finance area, that is the nucleus of our institutions. All financial transactions and operating activities flow through the financial department. Enrollment retention, academic programs, information technology, institutional advancement, human resources, and the list goes on. And so even though those areas may not technically report to the CFO, when decisions are being made, when discussions are happening in those areas, the CFOs are often included. And if they're not, they should be, because all of those areas directly impact the financial positions of our institutions. So today, I would like for the CFOs at our member institutions who are here with us, if you would please raise your hand so that we can acknowledge you. Not only the CFOs, but we also have controllers here. We have AVPs of finance. We have other financial professionals within our institutions. They are all the unsung heroes. And I think it's important that we take the time to recognize them for all the work and hard effort that they put into continuously improving our institutions. So now we'll move on to today's session, which is about delivering the promise of Black higher education by engaging historically Black colleges and universities and predominantly Black institutions to drive economic opportunity for the students and the broader community. We know that HBCUs already punch above their weight. So this morning we ask, what is the promise of Black higher education when Black colleges are activated to achieve goals across sectors and for the broader society? To help us begin to explore this question, it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Duwain Pinder, leader of the McKinsey Institute for Black Economic Mobility, a research institute and think tank dedicated to advancing racial equity and inclusive growth in the United States and globally. Today, we'll hear from Duwain from McKinsey's assessment of the role HBCUs play as engines of economic mobility. Please join me in welcoming Duwain.
Thanks, Shamika. And it's such a pleasure to be with you all today. Shamika said, my name is Duwain Pinder. I'm a partner with McKinsey and Company, one of the leaders of our higher education practice, but also our Institute for Black Economic Mobility, a think tank founded with the goal of accelerating Black economic mobility globally. And so I'm very excited to be with you all at this illustrious gathering where we really talk about some of the premier institutions that have served not just Black folks in higher education, but Black folks in the community more broadly. So maybe I'll just start with some research that McKinsey did last year. We released it on Juneteenth, and it was called The Economic State of Black America. And the goal really was to talk about what is in terms of the disparities, but also talk about what could be. And we looked at the Black American experience through 5 different roles: the worker role, the business owner role, the consumer role, and the saver role, and then finally the resident role. And what we found is not just disparities, but significant opportunity for the economy, not just for Black Americans, but the economy for all to be more thriving and more dynamic. So let me just go through some of the opportunities that we found. In terms of the worker role, what we found is there's significant wage disparities. If Black Americans were at parity in terms of their representation in the economy, you would have $220 billion more in Black Americans' pockets. That's from being in different roles, but also within the roles getting paid more relative to white and other counterparts. We also see that about 50% of Black workers are in jobs that pay less than $30,000 a year. So significant opportunities for Black Americans relative to the worker role. We go to the business owner role. Black Americans represent about 13% of the economy relative to the population, but only 2% of business owners. And I think that's the challenge relative to the representation. How do we accelerate entrepreneurship and accelerate business ownership? And not just accelerating the number of firms, but actually increasing the amount of revenue per firm. We found that Black firms make 60% less revenue relative to white-owned firms. When it comes to consumers, about 5% of the Black American population is in food deserts, in consumer deserts relative to the opportunity and relative to the products and services that they look for. What we find is that there's almost $300 billion of spend from Black Americans that's coming from consumers that are dissatisfied. So significant opportunity for the private sector in particular to better meet Black Americans' needs across sectors and across goods. When it comes to savers, significant opportunity. Almost 20% of Black families have a negative net worth, significantly higher relative to white families. And there's a 8 to 10 times racial wealth gap relative to the median family. And finally, when it comes to residents, what we found is that if Black Americans were at parity, they'd be living almost 4 years longer. And you think about the impact of just that life relative to the overall economy. And we find that when we look at public spending, 30% of public spending goes to programs that actually exacerbate racial disparities. And so this gives you at least a picture of significant disparities relative to the overall economy, but significant opportunity for Black Americans to play a much more thriving and dynamic role in the United States economy. And so the question is, what is the pathway to get to this outcome? You're going to need private sector, social sector, public sector institutions to really collaborate to really provide this future. And HBCUs are a really important part of this overall story. And what we find is that HBCUs, face challenging circumstances, a 7 times difference in their overall endowment, a $22 million difference in annual gifts. Relative to the overall economic environment, almost 2/3 of HBCUs are in environments that have lower job creation and lower economic output. But what we see, as Shamika said, is HBCUs punch above their weight. In terms of economic mobility, 2 times more economic mobility relative to the average institution, and almost 5 times more economic mobility relative to the Ivy Plus institutions. Significant output in terms of degrees. 17% of Black degrees come from HBCUs relative to the 3% of institutions that HBCUs represent. And a 44% increase relative to the economic output of every dollar that you invest in HBCUs. So if you think about what this future of a more dynamic, more thriving economy with Black Americans could look like, you have to have an HBCU sector that's going to be thriving and going to be supportive of that. And what we see is that HBCUs are already playing this role. Across all of these roles, HBCUs have been one of the premier foundational community institutions, and that exists today. We have examples where institutions like Morehouse are starting programs to actually accelerate Black incomes relative to their online programs. We have institutions like Howard that are expanding opportunities for business ownership and entrepreneurship. We have institutions like the University of District of Columbia that are removing barriers for Black consumers relative to providing opportunities for Black consumers to find goods and services that they need. Fisk University is an example that is actually investing in financial advancement on their campus. And then North Carolina A&T is an example of an institution that actually has a K-12 high school on their campus that's actually serving the surrounding community. And so, the future that we paint, HBCUs don't need to do a new thing. They need to be doing more of what they're already doing. And that really is how we get to the future that potentially, we could see this thriving, more dynamic economy. So the final thought is, what we did in terms of the analysis was to say, HBCUs are really in a moment right now. A lot of corporations are looking to say, how do we incorporate HBCUs as part of our overall racial equity strategy? And so there has been increased attention and increased funding. But we know that that's not sufficient. And if you actually saw more sustained giving relative to the overall output of HBCUs, you could see dramatically improved lives and livelihoods for Black Americans and a dramatically more thriving and dynamic U.S. economy. And what we calculated is that, if HBCUs potentially could live up to the potential relative to the funding that they receive, you could have $10 billion more of Black incomes. You could have $1.2 billion more of incremental business profit per year, $300 million of decreased student loan debt, and $1 billion additional consumer spending. And that's just from HBCUs alone, let alone the impact that they could have on their broader communities. And so the question that I'll leave you all with today is, how can our entire society see HBCUs not just as historic, important institutions that birthed the civil rights movement, led to a lot of the thriving Black middle class that we see today, but not just how can they do that, but how can they be a part of a future that has a thriving, more dynamic economy, not just for Black Americans, but for the entire society. Thank you.
Thank you, Duwain. This was great. I'm now pleased to introduce the moderator of today's panel, Dr. Suzanne Walsh. She is the current president of Bennett College, one of 2 HBCUs in the United States that decided to educate women. Dr. Walsh is a national leader and has received recognition and praise for her work supporting organizations and the intersection of innovation, technology, and learning. Before taking the helm of Bennett, Dr. Walsh served as Deputy Director of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's Post-Secondary Success Division, where she focused on supporting students and improving graduation rates. We're thrilled that she has agreed to join us and moderate our power-packed panel. Please join me in welcoming to the stage President Walsh and today's panelists.
Thank you. Thank you for doing the abbreviated. Good morning. Oh, I hate that picture. I didn't know what picture it was. I apologize to all of you for that. That is horrible. Wait, is it horrible? It is. I made my hair that day. You all know what I'm talking about. Oh my! And then it had to be on the big screen. Oh. Okay. Well, after that, good morning to all of you. Good morning. Good morning. I am not reading anyone's bios. Ooh. And it's going to be a first name only panel. Ooh. So this is going to be exciting already. I'm going to just ask each of you to introduce yourselves and just tell us a little bit about the organization or sort of stakeholders you represent today. I'm going to start right here.
All right.
Go ahead.
Good morning. I am Naomi Shelton, the Chief Executive Officer of the National Charter Collaborative. I have to mention I am also a 4th generation graduate of Tougaloo College in Tougaloo, Mississippi. Our motto, of course, is where history meets the future, and of course my history is meeting my future right now. Nice. I'm a former employee of the K-12 advocacy work of UNCF. I currently serve again as CEO of the National Charter Collaborative, where we support single-site charter leaders of color. I know that charters are a 4-letter word in some rooms, but when they are founded and led by people of color, I think that can tremendously change what's possible for children of color in this country.
Nice. The other Shelton.
And we're still trying to figure out if we're cousins. So my name is Jim Shelton. I'm Chief Investment and Impact Officer. I keep trying to get away from titles. So Chief Investment and Impact Officer at a place called Blue Meridian Partners. For those of you trying to figure out why that is, why people are clapping, we just finished making the initial $60 million investment in HBCUs. Support some of the work. I have a background both in philanthropy as well as, which is why I'm here today, but also served as Deputy Secretary in the Obama administration of the Department.
Can we bring you back?
People are doing a great job today. In fact, we're about to hear about one of the great people who's joined the current administration in the body of work. But I was the Deputy Secretary under President Obama for the Department of Education, and also led the initial head of the My Brother's Keeper program when it was still inside government. I'll stop there.
Okay. Dietra.
So good morning, everybody. My name is Dietra Trent, and I officially serve as the Executive Director of the White House Initiative on HBCUs. My role is really Chief Ambassador and Chief Cheerleader for HBCUs. I always say that my greatest claim to fame is that I graduated from Hampton University. I have an extensive background, mostly in government and higher ed. I served for 3 governors and as Deputy Secretary and Secretary of Education in the Commonwealth of Virginia, as well as served at VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University, George Mason University, and Radford University. So I have extensive higher ed and government experience. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Byna, Elliott. I lead Advancing Black Pathways for JPMorgan Chase, and that's a global strategy to really address and close the racial wealth gap in this country and in the world, where we have offices and where we have employees. So I have people in Brazil, Europe, Middle Eastern, Africa, and a lot of people in North America, because we have a lot of issues to close. But if we talk about sort of my real title, is I'm a mother, and I've been celebrating all week. My son had his prom on Saturday. He graduated yesterday from my alma mater, so I was a proud mom twice. And he will be attending Howard University in the fall. And I already have one baby that graduated from Howard. I went to a PWI because I couldn't get in and afford Bennett College or Spelman.
We will bring you back.
Thank you. I would love to come back. But I'm living my best life through them because they had a great experience at HBCU, and I'm excited to see my son go there in the fall and have a great experience at Howard University.
I mean, look at this panel. We can just stop there because this is an incredible group. So we're here to talk about a topic that I think is really growing a lot of traction in the HBCU space, and that is to talk about collective impact. And I want to just start and ask each of you, what's your definition, or you can even just give words. You don't even have to give a full thought. But how do you think about collective impact? I'm going to start with you, Byna.
So when I think about collective impact, I think about it as all of the stakeholders. And we talk about stakeholders, that would be government, that would be our corporations, that would be our public entities coming together to be very intentional in investing in and providing resources to HBCUs. The person who talked before talked about over-punching your weight. When we think about what HBCUs are doing in our country to educate our most vulnerable young people and provide them education as well as those top performers, we know that we've not had enough resources to do the right work and be able to really impact a number of students that we want to have. So when we think about collective impact, I love to see where we're actually working all together around jobs and skills, creating the right opportunities for our young people to be prepared for the jobs of the future, and then do the legislative work that we need to do to make sure that when they graduate, that they get the right wages, that we close that gender and wage gap that we have from a race perspective, so that we can actually close the generational wealth gap we have in this country.
I love that. Dietra, how do you think about it?
So I don't know that I can top that definition. I'm not sure that I can add much to that definition. I can give an example of how that definition has worked in my past experience, and that is when I was secretary, we had a number of localities that did not have accredited schools. Mm-hmm. And so a part of what I did in that instance was to bring together all of the stakeholders, including nonprofits, including religious organizations, including government, local, state, and federal government, and bringing all of our resources to bear. Housing, we found that, some of our students, about 300 of those students were homeless. A lot of them didn't have food, so we brought in all of those resources to make sure that we were providing them with the kinds of resources that would allow them to actually function well in a classroom. And as a result of that, we had schools that were accredited, and even today, that program is still ongoing. So when I think about collective impact, it's exactly what she said. It's bringing all of the resources to bear to ensure that we are focusing in on whatever the issue may be or whatever the challenge may be, and we're putting all our resources, dedicating all of our resources to impacting that.
Anything you would add, Jim?
The only thing I do is just put an emphasis on the impact piece.
Yeah.
The collective effort and collective inputs are all drawn towards producing a very specific outcome. And that outcome is defined, it can be different things. So there's a collective impact in the context of HBCUs. One of the things we'll probably talk about is collective impact in the context of place. So one part of our work is, obviously, we're investing in HBCUs as institutions. Another part of our work is investing in regions nationally and neighborhoods that are trying to build ladders of economic mobility in the community. And when you try and do that from birth all the way through to college and career, then you are definitely drawing on the school system, the child welfare system, the health system, but also on business and the nonprofit sector and other institutions and community. And so being able to bring everyone together and be clear about the outcomes that matter for our young people is another form of collective impact, especially when everyone stays focused on the outcomes, not just the inputs and collaborating.
Anything you would add?
Just to point that with the proverb of, if you want to go far, fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. The idea of having the collective, and of course, focusing on particular issues, but recognizing how all of the work of those individual organizations has a collective impact. So making sure that folks are aware of and are communicative about what they're working on to determine where the overlaps, where's the synergy, and making sure that we're doing that and moving forward versus spinning our wheels on things that someone else may be tackling.
So as each of you has talked about, it sounds like we're starting to kind of put together these pieces, but the key is to make sure that we have all segments of a community working together, communicating together, going towards some sort of important impact. And one of the things that I wanted us to think about is there's this notion, so I have been reading this book, I'm on the board of this organization called the Harwood Institute, and there's a new book out by that group called Unleashed, and the subtitle is A Proven Way Communities Can Spread Change and Make Hope Real for All.
Nice.
And I like this quote because in the book he says, change spreads as a result of people working through networks, not through the whole community operating as if it was a single unit. And I think that really gets at what you were saying, Naomi. And I think far too often we try to make everybody act all the same. And then we wonder, well, how come change didn't happen? So I'm going to turn us to, with that in mind, thinking about everybody has something to contribute, I'm going to turn us to a conversation about the future. So let's imagine a future where all HBCUs are at the center of addressing the kinds of issues that we talked about earlier. And those issues are the kind of impact that we want to have is we want to have a more just, equitable, and fair and hopeful society. And so HBCUs as anchor institutions in that collective reimagining, that's kind of our backdrop. And the question we want to wrestle with together is how do we unleash that potential, not just of the HBCUs, but all of those other organizations with HBCUs, again, I think really leading that conversation. So I keep saying the future, I keep saying the future. When does the future start?
I believe the future, because, past is prologue. We've seen what's possible. One of the things that I've learned over my time in the education space, so of course, starting at UNCF to develop their K-12 advocacy strategy and implement that over time, the work that informed my work there was working for the district government and recognizing how we went about the change, the definitive shifts we wanted to see. That informed how I went about the work at UNCF and the work that I do now at NCC is really focused on how do we look at the collective, the fabric of our community to see what's possible. And so I think about my grandmother was a graduate of the Daniel Hand School, which was located on Tougaloo's campus. So the way that I think about the future is how do we make sure that HBCUs serve as the catalyst for education, not just in the higher ed space, but in K-12. P16, P20 is possible. We have college campuses that host schools now. I think there are about 8 or 10 currently. There's a school, a middle college on Tougaloo's campus now. So again, that cycle of what is possible. So I see the future as HBCUs being the hub of education for black students and for black educators, and that ecosystem building and creating what's possible for our total landscape.
Is the only role for HBCUs a role for to be in the business of education when we think about collective impact?
No.
No.
Oh, okay. Well, Jim, you were first in saying no.
But
Strong opinions, aren't there?
Well, I was just going to say, so one, obviously, there's nothing more important to determine, like you asked when the future starts.
Yeah.
And as we all know, it's become cliche, but the investment you make in a child today is literally determining the future, right? And so we know what the arc of that looks like. It looks like 10 or 20 or more years of investment along the way. And I was having this really fantastic conversation with folks you may have met, Cara, you may want to talk more about the work later on, about the role of community in helping our young people. And we talk a lot about the educational system, but I liken it to preparing someone and teaching them how to run, and then teaching them knowing that you're putting them on the down escalator, and how fast you have to teach them to run if the escalator is going down, versus even if it was just standing still, let alone moving in the same direction. So when we can think about the communities and the context in which our young people live, then we are able to actually provide a different and kind of opportunity for them, even when we're doing the best of educating them. So they're not having to fight against the down escalator. So what does that mean? It means that HBCUs, because they live in community, and because they have assets and resources that can be used to support community development around the campus, leveraging the campus around in that way. It can be used to provide access to educational opportunity for the parents as well as for the students. It can be places where leadership development happens among young people that connects college students to young people in the community, tutoring, et cetera, et cetera. So things related to education, but as much about the relationship and the connection as it is about the actual teaching of academic skills. Those are the kinds of things that HBCUs can do besides just teaching at the post-secondary level that can have a huge impact on the role they play in community.
Well, and I think that, Byna, you were jumping in there, and earlier you talked also about workforce. I mean, you started out by thinking about workforce and corporate. So is workforce just about workforce education? Is it training? How do you think about that?
So no, we think about it from a much broader perspective. One, we want to be an employer of choice. So when we think about how we can partner with HBCUs, we want to be a place where your students can be employed and get a livable wage and be a high earner, and be in places that we're not today. And if you think about banking and financing, financial industries, we are not in investment banking at a high level or number. We're not in commercial finance, and we're not in small business. And when you think about that chart you just saw around the economic impact, if we're not in those places where we are making the decisions or being a voice in the room, we will still stay behind. So we think about it in the terms of what we can do as a workforce to prepare for the workforce of our future, but also around providing opportunities for young people to have exposure and experience in corporate America. So we have a fellowship program that we launched 4 years ago. And it started with about 50 students in our first year. This year, I just welcomed all the fellows on Monday, and we have 388. They're well-paid jobs. They get a scholarship and a stipend at the end. We gave them a housing allowance, and they are guaranteed a traditional internship in their junior year. And when we think about that 50 students now is 388. And when we started our program, we had 6% of our traditional interns were Black or African American that self-ID'd. This year, we will have 16% of that cohort group are going to be Black, and they self-ID as Black or African American. And so when you talk about investing in our young people, as Jim said, and giving them the opportunity, they show up, they can do incredible work, and they're our future leaders. And I sat there in front of them last week and talked about the fact that I believe I'm going to work for them one day. And I hope that's the case. And I think that in that group, we're going to have the next CEOs that we can count now in our hand, that we will have way more than that. And when you think about entrepreneurship, if the HBCUs have those great entrepreneurship foundations, those are the employers of the future. Those are the biggest job creators we have in this country. So we really want to invest in them now so they have the skills and tools to be strong entrepreneurs and get to scale.
Dietra, is there anything you want to add to that?
You know, I think as from where I sit, when I think about the future, I think about today, right? Because, you know, I have a small window of opportunity to really make a difference. And so what I've been doing over the last 3 months is really spending a lot of time listening and meeting with HBCU presidents and working with UNCF and the other associations, as well as just learning, right? But another large part of that is also working with our federal government agencies to ensure that we're removing those barriers. And the conversation that I have with them is, I need you to take a look at your mission. And you are there to add public trust and public value to our citizens, and think about how much more that trust and that value would be if you have HBCUs sitting at the table. You've got to be inclusive. And so when I think about, you know, what is the future is we are at the table. We are doing the research. We are building capacity within our HBCUs, and we are doing the kinds of research that we need in this country in order to meet the challenges that we will continue to have unless we open those opportunities up to our HBCU community.
So I would love to amend what you just said, because I think our language, I don't know why this just struck me. A lot of times our language is about HBCUs being at the table. And I think I want us to say, at least in 2032, and really before that, we should be, like, it should be our table.
Yeah,
like everybody else should be coming to our table. Yeah.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
And so if that's the case, did you want to say something?
Well,
I saw a hand.
only because I was going to build on.
Go for it.
Because if the idea is, you know, whenever you do collective impact, there's a question of, like, different languages used, the anchor institution, the backbone organization. Who is actually playing the role of everyone, bringing everyone together? Who is playing the role of saying, we are agreeing to get these outcomes, and by the way, we're going to produce the data that says, are you actually producing the outcomes? And we're going to have shared accountability together about, are you doing what you said you're going to do, or you're not going to do what you said you're going to do? So the role and the opportunity for HBCUs, especially in our communities, because you are institutions, which means you have assets, you have capabilities, to play that role, to bring to bear the things that you do well already, research and analysis, and then to leverage in other resources that can be drawn in from other federal agencies and others to help get redistributed to community, as well as philanthropy and corporations and jobs, as well as, we didn't talk about the jobs that aren't fellowship jobs that can get done through workforce development on the campuses. Those are things where you can play the anchor role, not just be at somebody else's table.
Go ahead.
Well, I think part of that challenge has been over the years that the minimizing of what the work of HBCUs has been, and how the value proposition of those institutions. And so now that we're getting to a point where people recognize the work that has happened, the punching above our weight, all of those things, the economic engines that these institutions have been, and will continue to be. Now that these things, because we have a vice president who is a graduate of Howard, we have senators and Congress people who are graduates of these institutions, that people are starting to see the value of that. Any room that I go into, I mention the fact that I attended a small liberal arts college in Tougaloo, Mississippi. People are like, where is that? Recognizing that those were the centers of our communities for so long. And how do we make sure that we continue to not only set the table, but when we have to come into rooms, making sure that we are amplifying instead of minimizing what the impact of those institutions have been. There's limitless possibility, but if it only took UNCF pulling together the economic impact of these institutions, and I think that was within the last 5 years, that people started to see, oh, wow, that's interesting, I didn't know that. Well, we've known this entire time. This isn't anything that's brand new, which is why I believe the idea of there's no higher ed without K-12, right? You can't have kids come to college without having some level of like, oh, this is what education is, what it can be. We know that Montessori, for instance, as a way of educating students and bringing in this idea of inquisitive learning, that is something that you start and stoke that fire early, and then it continues. And I think as we continue to stoke and get people excited about what's possible for HBCUs, with HBCUs, and in partnership, and then actually listening to the leaders of these institutions. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we don't know, it's the pandemic, time isn't real. There was a report that UNCF released called Imparting Wisdom, and what K-12 could learn from HBCUs. And how do we make sure that we're imparting that information to the folks who need to hear it, and those who want to continue to amplify that. So I absolutely agree, but we have to make sure that we continue to beat the drum of why these institutions are important, because it's easy, as we heard on Monday night, it is easy for people to forget and to minimize and say, oh, that's not important, integration is the way, and it is not. We know that that's not how we have to go about doing our work.
So I'm still gonna fast forward us to 2032. We've already worked all that out. We are at the center, but one of the questions that I have is, have HBCUs in 2032, have we really identified our role in and for and with the community? As opposed, like there's one thing to talk about a pipeline, that's not the same as being in and of and for the community. And with collective impact, as you each talked about, there's a community role. So talk about, each of you, what is your organization doing today that you think really will have an impact? One of the things is, when we think about the role of those backbone organizations, it's to allow for economic, like we heard, how do HBCUs become the center of the economic engines for community? How do we, we've already talked about make connections with other educational parts of the pipeline, all of those things. So keeping in mind, we're at the center of all of this. What is it that your organization is doing today that is going to create this amazing future in 2032? What's maybe your top priority that you're like, yes, that sets us on that path? Who would like to start? Well, Dietra, I didn't even, who laughed? Was that too hard of a question? Did I tell?
Dr. Lomax laughing.
Dr. Lomax, I did not ask to be heckled during, goodness.
He's good at it, though.
I'm going to start with Dietra just because I haven't started with you yet.
I think probably the best tool that I have right now to have that impact in 2032 is the Partners Act, which UNCF was not only instrumental in writing it, but also making sure that it was passed. But that is the law now that requires all of our federal agencies to produce annual reports on how they will create more opportunities for HBCUs. And so I'm currently working agency by agency on those reports, making sure that we have goals in there, metrics, and also baseline data to ensure that we are holding our agencies accountable. So I think that's probably the most significant tool I have right now. The other thing is the budget. The president has put a lot of money in the budget for HBCUs. He put new money, $450 million for research for HBCUs, MSIs, and TCCs. He put an additional almost $300 million to enhance capacity at HBCUs. And so we are putting money behind in place. We've already delivered $5.8 billion in the last year and a half. And so I think when I think about what I have at my disposal right now is those two tools. The other thing would be kind of sort of the bully pulpit, and it goes back to what Naomi was talking about, and that is we really do need to take charge of our dialogue, our narrative, right? We have to own that. We have to own our greatness. We have to own our leadership role. We have to own our position and our value to this country. you know, we can't back down on that. So I think from my perspective, as I'm going around and talking to people and meeting with corporations and these agencies, it really is you need to have HBCUs at the table, right? I mean, you cannot effectively approach the challenges that you have unless you have us at the table. So,
do you think 10 years out, or do you just, that's for you, Dietra, as a follow-up, do you think 10 years out, or do you think in a shorter time frame?
What I think now is the urgency of now, and to ensure that I'm doing everything that I can right now to make sure that we are changing that culture. And so 10 years from now, if, you know, I hope I have more than, I hope I have 6 years, and I'm betting on 6 years, but I'm working like I have to. So it is urgent that we stay on it and we push it, and I'm so happy to have UNCF locking arms with them, because they're the ones who's really making the way for me. So the sharp elbows.
Absolutely.
Byna, what about you?
So we've actually launched a $30 billion racial equity commitment, of which HBCUs are a part of that commitment itself. So I'll walk through the $30 billion because it does have impact around place, around that collective impact. Because a significant amount of the dollars are invested for home ownership as well as affordable housing. So when you think about where HBCUs are located and the amount of land that they have, there are transactions and deals that can be made to help them redevelop or revitalize some of their properties or vacant land that can be used as a part of affordable housing, because we know we have an affordable housing gap. There's another $2 billion committed to small business and that ecosystem, whether it's training, education, and access to capital and tools that we'll use. And there's additional dollars that we did with minority depository institutions, which most of those MDIs is what we call them, are in those communities where our HBCUs are also located. And those are where we can have the best and brightest students connect with those MDIs to help provide solutions as they serve their communities. But specifically around HBCUs, our racial equity commitment, we focused on supporting jobs and skills, one for our workforce, but also around how do we support and cultivate the opportunities for the workforce of the future for other organizations as well. So I actually have 2 people on my team as part of Advancing Black Pathways that their sole job is to be a support for HBCUs. They have a portfolio of about 17 schools where we spend their time with leaders at those schools asking, what can we do to support your students and your student development? And in that, we provide dollars as well as resources in our human capital to help create the opportunities for those students to be ready for the workforce. And so that's really a big step for us, and that's their sole job, and we're looking to continue to grow that. And we've partnered with UNCF as well around a hardship fund. When we started, it was to help close that gap for students that were probably in their junior or senior year, so that they wouldn't have to leave school and have debt without a diploma. But we all know COVID happened, and so that changed. But so we really started to transition those dollars with UNCF and TNCF to support those students that just have temporary gaps or needs as they manage and migrate through COVID. And so we're going to start pivoting back to that, closing the gap so that students can graduate. But those resources were really critical, and we've reinvested in that. So we are not at 10 years yet where we need to get there, but we think about it in 5-year increments. So we look at all of our initiatives in 5-year, like what are we going to achieve in 5 years? And we commit for all 5 years, and then we go back and look at it again. So we haven't gotten to 10, but I can tell you that the work that we've been doing far exceeds the 5 years and the $30 billion commitment. We've had a good foundation of work, but we can still do more. And I want you all to challenge us on it. We committed to a racial equity audit because you saw a lot of pronouncements in the communities. And everybody's like, well, what's going to happen and who's going to hold people accountable for doing the things that they got headlines for? So we committed to a racial equity audit. We will have the results in the fall, where we've agreed to produce those results publicly and hold ourselves up to look in the mirror and say, these are things we've done well, these are things we need to work on. And we need your voice and your input as we continue to evolve our organization around doing the right things to bring everybody forward around racial equity and closing the gap.
Nice. Right? Okay. I'm gonna end with you, Jim Shelton, so I'm gonna come.
Okay.
It's tricky. You gotta stay alert. Naomi, tell us.
All right. So this year would mark the 10th anniversary of UNCF releasing a report about parents' perceptions of K-12 education. This would also be the 10-year, if I'd stayed, 10-year anniversary of me working
Oh,
at UNCF.
happy anniversary.
Oh, thank you.
Happy anniversary.
It's not, but I miss you all. So in thinking in 10-year increments, what I am focused on in evolving the strategy of NCC, the Charter Collaborative is committed to supporting an umbrella of support for our institutions, for the schools and the leaders that we serve. I think about the supply of new leaders, and that's not just people opening schools, but that's the supply of board members for each of those charter schools. That's the supply of possibly having HBCUs serve as authorizers for charter schools. We've seen and heard some of our partners in this work, including the National Association of Charter School Authorizers, wanted to really center communities. And they can't do that without the communities that need to be served, right? So thinking about how, again, HBCUs used to be the bedrock of education in their communities, having those institutions give back in that way. And I also think about what are the partners, who are the partners that we need to work with? So that supply of partnerships is at the Equitable Facilities Fund to make sure that there are buildings and spaces for these schools to open. I think about what does it mean to strengthen the leaders that are currently serving. We have a fellowship program, the Manati Fellowship. Manati is the Swahili word for catapult. How do we catapult folks into the next version of themselves as leaders? I've heard and seen some amazing school leaders who've said, I want to have a single site school that focuses on elementary school and nothing else. But I've also seen and heard people who say, I want to have the next KIP, right? And KIP was born out of the work of a black woman. Harriet Ball was an amazing classroom teacher who did a phenomenal job of doing her work every day. Two men created a whole network of schools based on that alone. And so we know that that is possible in our community. There are Harriet Balls walking the yards of HBCUs across this country right now. So I think about strengthening that opportunity. And then, of course, how do we sustain this work? So there's hearts and mind work that has to happen. Again, I said early on that charters are seen as a dirty word, but I think there's an opportunity for us to visit schools, look at the opportunities. There are schools right here in Atlanta that are doing phenomenal work led by people of color. I'm on a panel, we're on a panel with someone later today.
Come see us again.
Right. What is it, 2:15?
It is, I think.
Afternoon. We're like a,
we're a
duo.
Yeah, we're traveling.
And making sure that we're keeping that top of mind instead of getting caught up in the rhetoric around what are charter schools, they're stealing money, they're doing this, they're doing that. What is the opportunity? How do we take this as a renaissance moment for our community to use public dollars to improve the outcomes for kids? We talk about metrics, we talk about outputs and outcomes, we talk about holding people accountable. Well, let's look at the high standards that HBCUs have set for students and create that ecosystem, because charter schools need directors of operation. They need people who understand how to, distribute money, how to make sure that you're reporting out to the federal government what you're supposed to do. So not just the teacher pipeline, which is absolutely important, but let's think about it differently. Where's our black TFA, right? So the Norman C. Francis teacher pipeline, our teacher residency program at Xavier University, where are those? How are we creating more of those opportunities instead of squashing people's ideas of what's possible? The last 3 jobs that I've had did not exist before I had them. I think part of the reason that I'm able to do that is because I was able to navigate what it meant to be a student at Tougaloo College, right? So 1, I created my first job. I didn't know what that would be, right? 2, I landed at an opportunity at UNCF that did not exist a year before. I created a job at KIP. And the job that I have now, yes, we have co-founders, but I'm the first CEO that they've had. So visioning the future is also reimagining what's possible creating the possibility. So the work that I'm focused on and that NCC is really deliberate about right now is looking at that umbrella of support, but looking forward to see what's possible, and I don't see that possible without HBCUs.
Great.
Nice.
Jim, what are you up to?
Yeah.
$60 million.
So, I mean, I have the distinct advantage that, well, a few things. One is that my whole job is about improving economic and social mobility, and I work in philanthropy. And so I'm going to back up in the story just a little bit to get to where we were talking about. And so, you know, my whole job is to find the best investments. And I use the term investment, even though I'm using grants and philanthropy, because I'm impact focused. I'm like, okay, so I'm going to put the money in. What is going to come back in terms of improvement in people's lives? And so I say that because, and by the way, in every other room I'm in, I lead with the fact that I went to Morehouse. In this room, I figure if I do it right, y'all know without me having to say it. So, it's all right. So anyway, but when I'm out, so I imagine me scanning the entire landscape for the best investments in economic and social mobility. And the reason I say this is because I say this each time. I love my experience with Morehouse. There's nothing that changed my life more other than what my parents did for me. And yet, that has nothing to do with why I asked our partners to invest in HBCUs. The reason I said we should invest in HBCUs is, pound for pound, as we've said over and over again, HBCUs are one of the best economic mobility engines in the country, especially for black people, but period. And it has three parts to it. One is, as Mom said, the core mission, producing people who actually go on to actually, especially when we get them in the right professions, they're going to close $1 billion of the wealth gap just through HBCUs. The opportunity is 10. I think there's plenty of upside literally just through HBCUs. The second is what we already know, is that the ecosystem that Naomi talked about is full of leaders produced by HBCUs, disproportionately so, especially in the South, where we need it most. I do work across and go into a city, and how often is it the mayor or the head of the city council or the pastor of the biggest church, or take your pick, that are alums of HBCUs, and that's not just at the leadership level, but at the level of how work gets done in community, HBCUs are disproportionately represented. And then the third thing is the power that we've been talking about is the power in the local community. And so I lay that out because I want to say one of the first things for an anchor institution to be able to be an anchor institution is it's a stable institution. And the reality is that we've been punching above our weight, but we've also been doing many things with almost nothing.
Yeah.
And so the question becomes, how do we invest in ourselves in a way, and get other people to invest in us in ways that create sustainable, strong organizations that can actually perform that anchor role because they're not worried about what's going to happen tomorrow at the institution. And how do you create mechanisms for tying that to the good of the rest of the community so the community begins to recognize the value of the HBCU and want to invest in it? And so we're seeing this happen with many colleges around the country right now, HBCUs in particular. Johnson C. Smith, you know, that community has just really started to really recognize the power of that college in their community. And I think the same thing is going to happen around the country as institutions lean further into this work. So our initial investment actually started at the very beginning of COVID, which was, I'd done this analysis already, and then said, oh my gosh, most of the schools are tuition dependent. If somebody doesn't lean in with crisis management support, many of them may not be around at the end. And we are not in a position to be able to partner directly with colleges. And so fortunately, UNCF and Thurgood Marshall exist in the world, and an organization called EdAdvance had been started to work on how you actually provide broad cross-sector support to HBCUs, produce shared service that can be used, and produce tools and resources over time that can be shared. But the most important thing was, how can you help more schools get through this period? The great news was that colleges came together in incredible ways with the leadership of UNCF and the others that I mentioned. And so it made it very easy on the back end of that to say, let's keep investing. And so then it was, okay, well, what is most needed? And it's the sustainability and transformation work that we talked about. And I'll speed up.
So I think in about 3 minutes, we're going to take questions from the audience. So get your thoughts together, your questions. You know, one of the things that I think is so interesting about this conversation is There's a through line, which is also, while I keep pushing for HBCUs to be at the center and everyone agrees, there's also, I think each of you has kind of pushed back in a different way, and then also saying it's HBCUs plus, right? It's HBCUs plus corporations, plus government, plus K-12, plus charters, I mean, in particular. And so, you know, one thing that as you're all thinking about what does collective impact look like, I think it's important for us to remember that it is all of us working together. So yes, I'm advocating, and we're all advocating, yes, HBCUs should be at the center, maybe the convener, but we can't do it alone. And so the idea of working in community, Jim, as you just said, you know, tying the success of the community along with HBCUs. I don't know that I can see out there, but how many of you are institutions that have like tall gates and tall walls to get in? Anybody at one? Do you have to go through a gate, like one single gate? No. So Tougaloo. So that's, and I bring this up because some of our physical footprint, right, it looks very open. So at Bennett, like, we don't have any walls, like barely, people can just step over the wall. It's very open, and yet sometimes I don't always feel like we're open to the community. So I'm raising this because we've put forth a great future vision, but it also means making sure that we do away with either metaphorical or real kinds of walls as we think about this. So I'm going to open it up if there are any questions from the audience. And again, I can't really see. So you're going to have to yell at it. You can heckle like somebody up here in the front row did earlier.
As people are collecting
yes, please.
their thoughts,
yeah.
I know that, Jim, you were going to finish your thought.
It's okay, go ahead.
So I was an English major. So, of course, literature, but also movies mean a lot. Dr. Lomax, what were you a professor of?
English.
Yes.
Oh, my goodness.
And I just have to say, my advisor, the only reason he left Tougaloo College was because of Dr. Lomax. Thank you for stealing Dr. Jerry Ward.
Oh, you mean in a good way he left? Because I was like, he left because of Dr. Lomax?
Exactly.
Oh, my God. Scandal.
My advisor was also my mother's advisor, 25 years apart, right? So I think about movies and art as a part of how we tell stories and how we look at history. So how many of you all have seen School Days?
Yes.
Right? If you haven't, now come on.
How many of y'all are in it? No.
Right.
That's what I was going to say.
Right. But, I mean, more of you all need to watch School Days, right? Because there are several conversations that are happening in that film that are still happening today,
That's right.
Unfortunately. There are two things. So one, of course, about financial stability, sustainability, et cetera, but there's another around community and the people in the community feeling very disconnected from these highfalutin Negroes, right?
Yes.
As a black woman, I like to say a free black woman.
Yes.
My mother would love for me to perm my hair. I will not.
Excellent.
So she transitioned and said, well, why don't you get sister locks? I'm thinking about it.
Oh.
But the idea, thank you. But the idea of like history meeting the future again, right? And how do we break down those barriers of community and those of us that are in and of products of the higher ed space? So one of the things I will say to all of you all is when we talk about children, because they are our future, Whitney Houston told us so.
She did. She did.
She did.
She really did.
And if you haven't heard that song, then we have to have a whole conversation. But there's an ongoing conversation that has grown in the black community to one, and of course Erica Green wrote a recent piece about HBCUs, and we see this renaissance of appreciation.
Yes. Yeah.
But there has also been this undercurrent for several decades of like, oh, HBCUs, they're this, they're that. But how are we thinking about amplifying, right? So how are we thinking about how we speak about and to our children? Not those kids, our kids.
Right.
So not those communities, our community.
Our community.
I tell people all the time, I live across the street from my elementary school. Like directly, I look at the teacher's parking lot of my elementary school in Washington, D.C. And what I know to be true is when I hear my gentrifying neighbors talk about those kids, I make it clear I was one of those kids. And so those of us who have had the ability to have a trajectory change and shift because of the institutions we attended, make sure that we are thinking about reaching back. So those walls may be there, but how are you opening the doors,
That's right.
right? How are we thinking about talking about the kids in our communities, not just those kids, not just, oh, those parents. Those same parents are the ones that could send their children to your HBCU. So how are we opening those doors and creating those opportunities? And if you have to sit back and watch A Different World to think through what that looks like, let's do that. So y'all have assignments. Listen to Whitney Houston.
Watch School Days.
Watch School Days. And sit up and just watch, you know, turn it on Netflix. I think it's on Netflix. A Different World. And that actually could open your mind about what's possible for an ecosystem.
And so good night, everyone.
Absolutely. The one thing I would say that we need to pull the string on what Jean talked about around economic mobility. When I just looked at the research, you guys are number one, Susan, for number one school in the country around economic mobility. And as I scrolled that list, there were a ton of other HBCUs. And that's a narrative when we talk about HBCUs being at the center of community. The fact that you have that, the results around economic mobility says that that's your why. And that why isn't just the students on campus, it's all the things that create the halo effect of those students being educated and changing the trajectory of their lives, their families' lives, and the communities that they serve. So I think that's a narrative that we really, when you talk about sit at our table, you're the economic mobility engine for a lot of our black communities. That's our table.
Dr. Lomax, what's the name of the report about economic impact? Oh, there's Rodriguez now. Rodriguez, do you know the name of it?
It's the new, wait, economic impact.
He's up. Go ahead,
He
Rodriguez.
stood up. He was ready.
Just say it out loud,
Just
man.
say
Go
it.
ahead.
The economic impact report on HBCUs.
Everybody
Thank
memorize
you.
it.
I was going to say, y'all both went to Morehouse. Y'all were mighty quiet.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Just, did anyone have a question for us? Oh. Oh.
One question.
Sure.
Because I think one of my concerns about the narrative is that I still get the question, do we need all the HBCUs? And I would like to just hear some affirmation about the importance of all the HBCUs and that none of them are expendable and that we need to do more to tell what the contributions they are making and what the investments could be that could enable them to make more. So I'd like a little bit of that differentiation. And some of that same questioning comes from people who look like us.
Which one of you would like to take that on?
Do you want to do it, or I can do it? Why don't you go ahead?
Go on.
I'll take it.
Go on, Jim.
So I'll just go ahead. Part of the argument that we've been talking about all day are the multiple roles of HBCUs. And this is actually going to tie all these pieces together. This thing about creating an ecosystem and how you produce the leaders that are going to actually drive the different organizations in your in the communities. It's, you know, the name now that you're going to start hearing in all the circles is civic infrastructure. Right? What is the civic infrastructure and how is it built? And what is clear is that in every community that an HBCU is in, the civic infrastructure, especially the black civic infrastructure, is powered by that HBCU or HBCU somewhere. And so the question becomes, can you and how do we stabilize the institutions wherever they are, however small they might be, so they can continue to play that role? Now, I want to be real. The reality is the entire higher education system is going to contract. This is not about HBCUs. This is about all post-secondary institutions. You're starting to see it now, are feeling the pressure of the shift in how people can get educated, how people are being hired, all of these things. And so this is not just a question of do people believe in HBCUs or not. It is how does the distinctive value proposition of even the smallest HBCU become so clear that in the face of market forces saying close down more small colleges, HBCUs say, but wait. Here's what we do for our community. Here's what we do for the economy around our school. And here's what we do for the talent infrastructure for companies like JPMorgan Chase, but also all those regional employers that nobody else is going to be talking about. It is not going to be an easy story to tell, but it is a story that can be told if we make these bets on the future that we talked about.
Yeah.
Stability first.
Yep.
Prove it. And then here are all the other things that we can do, and the money will come.
Oh my, anything anyone wants to add? Byna, you looked like you wanted to say something.
The only thing I would say is that it takes all of the parties, that collective impact, to get to the stability. And that means that the things that we haven't done for the last 100 years of HBCU's existence, we need to do differently. Mm-hmm. And we need to ask for and insist on the right set of resources to get to stability. Saying, we hope you get there, will not work. We have to invest a lot of money in our HBCU structure.
Can I say one last thing then? On that point, part of our analysis is that if you look at the gap for HBCU endowments, depending on how you cut the number, it's $6 to $10 billion. $6 to $10 billion. And because HBCUs enroll twice the percentage of low-income students, the needs of the students actually for aid are even higher to have an expectation of the completion.
Correct.
So these are things that we all know, but we need to drive it into the psyche of people that if you want to see the kind of stability that you have blamed HBCUs for not having for years, then let's talk about that gap.
Yep.
And then let's talk about how we invest to give people even a shot to perform at the level that you've been asking for.
We totally agree. Totally agree.
And I think, the question about do we need all the HBCUs, that's like asking, do we need all communities? Because it's not just about us. I think that the challenge that I think this panel has really put before all of us is to really engage fully with our communities and to do it in a way that, to go back to one of the things that Dietra talked about is, this is also about the public trust. The public trust in our communities and in our institutions, and thinking about how we can invite investment and encourage investment is because we are seen as vital to the community. We are seen as central to the community. I think that's been a theme that's come through over and over again. The idea that we're in the business of producing those board members for charter schools, employees, all of those things are really, I think, it positions us, again, very differently than to just talk about, oh, yes, we've produced students with degrees. We've produced graduates. It's actually all the way back to this economic impact. Yeah, please, go ahead.
And I think I have to say this.
Please.
The fact that Bloomberg has made a significant investment in UNCF to expand and to grow the charter sector, and how important that investment is on the front end, right?
Yeah.
But that not only do we create stability, but sustainability over time. We have to think about what does that mean to not only secure and have a great foundation, but what does that look like for years to come? So the 10 years, what does it look like 100 years from now?
Exactly. So I'm going to...
Suzanne, can I just mention one last thing? To that question, do we ever get the question of, do we need all of our PWIs?
Right.
So why do we feel like we have to, why do we have to justify why
That's right.
It's very obvious. This panel has talked about how obvious it is and how important it is to have HBCUs at the table. But we always have to justify why we're there or who we are, right? And I just think that we got to start pushing back, and that's a part of the narrative that we have to take on.
Oh my God. Well, I'm getting the hook from backstage. Oh, but you're going to say okay? Okay. Dr. Lomax said okay. Sorry, Julian. Sorry. I've lost control per usual.
So Mel Foster at Morehouse College. We were having a conversation at our table about the rankings, college rankings. And it sure sounds like, from the tenor of this conversation, that that's what you're speaking to, essentially, right? When you start asking about are HBCUs still relevant, and the question's not being asked about PWIs, well, we're being asked to compare ourselves to them. Is it not time to create a new paradigm
Of course.
for what is
Of
a good
course.
higher education institution that appeals to African Americans?
I think she talked about it because there's a great article that came out. I actually cried like 3 times reading the article because it was my lived experience. My daughter was a very competitive student and had a lot of offers. And when it got down to it, she said, I'm going to an HBCU. We didn't visit a HBCU. We went to Harvard, Stanford, and she made a choice. And it's the best choice she ever made. And it was a very different discussion when my son made this choice. We were cheering. We're like, yes, go there, because your experience is real, and it makes a big difference. And they're not comparable. Her experience that she had at Howard did not compare to the experience she would have had at the University of Michigan or other schools that she would have gone to. And now she's in med school because of her HBCU experience. And she says, if I would have gone to a PWI, Mom, I don't think I would have been confident enough and had the skills and talents that I have today to compete.
That's right.
And so we don't think it's a ranking issue. We know that there's a difference in our HBCU experience. What we want to do is own that conversation and make sure that we're getting paid and supported for the value we bring to our communities. And then make sure that the big dollars don't go to PWIs and then we get the small dollars for the work that we do when we're over punching our weight, that we need to go to the table boldly and ask for the resources we need and insist on legislation that changes the funding mechanisms for how we're funded. We did lose control.
Okay, before I really get the oh shoot, somebody just Julian, I can't. There, people are standing up.
And your man gave her a mic. Like,
I mean, I don't know what to do. What am I? We're going to have to. You can get us after, and also we're on another panel.
You can
so.
come talk to us.
But no, so let me. I'm so sorry. Let me thank this panel, and thanks to all of you for getting so engaged, because all of a sudden people are popping up. That means that folks are really wrestling with the questions and the ideas that you've each raised. Thank you. Please thank this fantastic panel. And we will be around, I think, for the rest of the day. I'm committing everyone. Yes, for the rest of the day, we will all, you can find all of us. Thank you all.
Everyone, let's give another round of applause to these amazing panelists and the moderator, Dr. Suzanne Walsh. Thank you all. To discuss a new innovative project designed to activate equity among some of our nation's most prominent organizations, please welcome to the stage the CEO, Action for Racial Equity Fellow, and Vice President at U.S. Steel, Anthony Ashe.
Sorry, Mr. Carter. You're right. Can you all hear me all right? I apologize, a little bit of a traffic jam in the back. How do you follow that group? So first of all, if we could just give another round of applause for Duwain and the panel. They were incredible. It doesn't appear to be the right PowerPoint. I don't feel like I'm Mark Alexander. If you guys just give me a moment. As my team knows, I could wing it, but I should probably go with slides. Anyone in the back? Are we working on it?
Yeah, give us 1 second. Give us 1 second. Pardon the technical difficulties, y'all.
Technical difficulties, and I'm the one between them and a break. And me trying to jet for an earlier flight to get home to my wife and kids before I then leave at 7 a.m. tomorrow. I do see on the run of show it tells me to exit stage, so I could.
So what we're going to do, you all, we are just going to go ahead and go to break first, give you all a break first, and then we'll come back for this presentation. All right, so let's go ahead and cut the music on, you all. Go ahead, stretch your legs, take a break, and we'll come back for this presentation.
Got it. Okay, go ahead and handle that. Just keep the live stream going. And where are you going? All right, you seeing the audio? All right, Anthony, you getting the audio? All right, Jim, do a countdown. Yeah. No, I'm just saying keep counting. But you need to hear him. Yeah, I need to hear him. I just told him to do a countdown. All right. All right. All right. Now you do a countdown. Keep going. Are you getting them? Are you seeing his audio? Not yet? All right. Where are we? Huh? Who? Are you getting audio? All right. All right. Sun's coming in, but it's all right. All right. Hoo-wee-hoo. That's what's been up. Got it set up where? Got it. So back in California, so you're now where? Oh, okay. Because you were back in California for how long? Got it. Because that was with the Zuckerberg, right? Got it. Yep. What? Oh. So you were in D.C. during COVID, or you were there? Yeah, Doc. All right, we ready? Hey, no, when I sit in the chair, I'm ready to go.
Yeah.
When I sit down, I'm ready to get it. What? Always ready to get it. All right, I see y'all people in the chat. Lincoln College of Illinois is not an HBCU. It is a PBI, predominantly black institution. It's not an HBCU. Just so y'all know the distinction. All right, where are we?
10-9-8-7-6-5-4-3-2-1. 10-9-8-7-6-5-4-3-2-1.
Are we ready? Are you recording? You recording? Yes. Got it. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, Jim. Let's talk about philanthropy. HBCUs. You've been with Department of Education. You've worked with Zuckerberg. Now with Bloomberg. What's this?
I work with Meridian Partners.
Say it again?
Meridian Partners.
So all this noise in here, I thought you said Bloomberg.
Yeah.
And so we have seen a tremendous amount of philanthropic support for HBCUs in the wake of the death of George Floyd.
Sure.
McKinsey Scott has has dramatically increased the endowments. Do you see this continuing? What are you seeing and hearing when it comes to nonprofits, philanthropists, foundations, even corporate execs, as they now are reassessing in how they look at HBCUs today?
Sure. So I've seen what you saw, which was a tremendous influx from people who were feeling the need for the outpouring. Some of that was deep and sincere and recognizing that they hadn't done it before. Some of it was, we need to do something. HBCU is a good target. And now what we're seeing is that money is slowing down. And when it comes in, it's coming in very targeted ways that may not be for general operating support or for endowment, but to do a specific project at a school. And so the work that I'm doing right now through Meridian Partners is to invest in HBCUs in their core infrastructure, and then to also try and use that as a way to catalyze more investment that can go to general operating support and ultimately to close the kind of endowment gap that we see.
You know, one of the things that I often say is that there are things that we are aware of, white folks ain't got no clue.
Yeah.
Ava DuVernay said they were flying to Essence, they were in L.A., and she's in first class, Charlie Wilson in first class. And all the black folks get on the plane, were speaking to Uncle Charlie, and the white folks had no idea who the hell Uncle Charlie was. And that to me is sort of the example of, we know about the engineering graduates at Prairie View A&M University. We know about Florida A&M, their business school.
Right.
But the reality is these, frankly, white-led companies, white philanthropists, literally have no idea about what's happening in black America.
Yeah.
And they've been, when Reverend Jackson was talking to Silicon Valley, was forcing them to say, why are you not partnering with these schools? You keep saying you can't find them. They're there.
Yeah.
You just got to go outside of your comfort zone to reach them.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of what has happened is the attention now has got the spotlight on HBCUs. People are now aware, and that they're still like, okay, our systems are not set up. We've been doing our recruiting at this set of schools for the last 50 years. How are we going to incorporate these new schools? We've got a way that we actually find our engineers. This is not exactly where we need to go to find our engineers. How are we going to change our systems to do that? We can do it on a one-off.
They've been so used to going, frankly, to the same white schools, hiring their graduates. They go into senior positions. They keep going back there. And this is now prying those doors open, saying, no. You keep saying you want them, you're going to have to recruit these students differently than you do these largely white students or Asian students from these Stanfords, from
Right.
schools like that.
And so the question is now that door has been pried open, now that they are looking at HBCUs to actually recruit students, now you say, okay, well, great, this is a great pipeline. How are you investing in that pipeline to make sure it can be there in the future? How are you going to expand this pipeline so we can get more STEM graduates out of these schools, or whatever the things are that you care about? How are you investing in these that they're in your community? How are you investing so that they can actually play a broader role in supporting the surrounding community? Because you have a lot of cities that are high growth, like take your Atlantas, take your Charlottes of the world, where the growth happens, but the black people there don't benefit from it.
And so when you talk about the investment, because again, the flip side, what they often say is that, oh, well, they're lacking in this, lacking in that. Well, hell, if you were putting the resources in those programs when they're walking the doors as freshmen, then you're basically curating the type of graduate that you want. But without that level of investment on the front end, and you're complaining about the back end, you're not going to get that type of graduate that you want.
Yeah, we've done the analysis. There's somewhere between a $6 to $10 billion gap in the endowments of HBCUs.
$6 to $10
billion gap on endowments for HBCUs. So if you said, look, colleges use their endowments for all kinds of things, financial aid, investing in innovation, and supporting new facilities and all that stuff. If you said just that gap alone, even just what does that mean every year? That's $500 million a year. If you were just doing 5% from it, that you would say was missing from the operations of HBCUs to be able to support their student body. But then you go to the fact that HBCUs enroll twice the percentage of low-income students as other schools. And you go, well, we actually need more financial aid. We need more support for our students than other schools. So you go, okay, so what would that investment actually look like? And then you go, okay, so now we have the opportunity to say, because in the grand scheme of things, $10 billion is actually not that much money. The real question is who's going to be willing to make the investment and invest in the future and support the schools in the way that's necessary.
And see, that's the thing that I talked about this constantly on the show when I'm talking about that I keep using that we're in this third Reconstruction, that we have to be looking at this moment from a Reconstruction standpoint in terms of which really means rebuilding. And so if you're a state HBCU, I've said this here, you see successful lawsuits. Unfortunately, it took 13 years in Maryland. You had the lawsuit years ago in Mississippi led by Alvin Chambers. I've argued that we should have our lawyers looking at lawsuits for our public HBCUs in Texas, in North Carolina, and other places, because the reality is those states have grossly underfunded those schools and forced them to do more with less.
Yes, and so the reality is that when you take a look at the historical underfunding of HBCUs, not only do you have the fact that those dollars have not been there, but then you think about deferred maintenance. We've not been able to invest in the infrastructure. We've not been able to invest in the facilities. We've not been able to build out programs in the way. And so the cost of that lack of investment is even higher than the dollars that were missed. Whether or not a state HBCU can be a party to the suit to sue the government they count on for their daily bread is a question. But can somebody be involved in?
Well, in the case of Maryland, you had
outside parties.
Outside parties
Yeah.
on behalf of the 4 HBCUs in Maryland. That's what led to that nearly $500 million settlement. And they should have gotten $2 billion. You're right. See?
But the great news is, yes, and besides that, philanthropy can play a really powerful role, especially in our interim. Private investment in post-secondary institutions is a way of life in America. People are just used to writing very big checks in their communities to the primarily white institutions. I know of one city not too far from where we are right now where a foundation pretty easily wrote a $100 million check to one institution in the town, and in the same breath didn't miss a beat saying, oh yeah, we wrote a $5 million check to another institution across town. Guess what the difference in the institutions was? You know, the PWI gets $100 million, the Black HBCU gets $5 million, and it seemed just fine. And no one thought twice.
But you know what, though? I think that, to that particular point there, one of the things that I've long argued is that we as African Americans, because we've rarely been at the table of power, we don't think in the same way. In that, we may come to the table sort of apologizing, trying to get 100,000, versus someone else walking in and easily asking for 10 million. Steve Perry said, we were talking, he was talking with a guy on Wall Street, and I think Steve was trying to get 500,000. And the guy said, Steve, how much you think Eva Moskowitz asked us for? And Steve told me, he said, man, I was sort of like apologizing, even asking for the $500,000. So Steve threw a number, the guy said $50 million the first time. And Steve was like, damn.
Right.
He said, now here's somebody who ain't afraid to ask for money, but again, here's someone else walking in and saying, I need $50 million. So I think part of this also is that we've got to elevate our boards of trustees
and aspirations
and executives and have folks who have been at the table of power who can then walk into corporations, walk into philanthropists, and literally walk in and making the case why we need $100 million, as opposed to what you just described, we get $5 and we're ecstatic. We sit up, folks are just happy, as opposed to saying, no. That's simply not enough. I think that's also part of this deal that we also have to address in our community.
I think that the first question is, what do you expect? And whatever you expect sets a ceiling on what you're going to get. That's the first thing. The second thing is, the reality is that the underinvestment had an impact, right? And so we serve higher needs students. We've had underinvestment. It actually has had a real impact on our ability to deliver on the mission.
Right.
And so that makes you a little bit nervous when you walk in, because you say, yeah, they kind of got a point. And the reality is, no. When you do the analysis and you compare HBCUs to comparable institutions, they outperform on almost every metric, especially when you look at the ones that have had a little bit of resource to work with in the process.
Right.
And so the key question is, what would happen if you actually invested the resources to let them be on equal footing? And then once you come in with the thing that says, actually, I am an underinvested, high-performing asset.
Right.
Give me resources and look at what I can do. It should shift the entire conversation. So then right now what I'm focused on is, so how do you get more institutions that core infrastructure dollars so they can show what they can do,
right, even
with just a little bit. And then that just creates the flywheel where then you go, okay, that's great, but here's what I really need.
Well, it reminds me during the Obama administration with the management of TARP funds. I remember having a meeting in the Department of Treasury, and people tell me that the black-owned and minority firms vastly outperform white firms of the management of TARP funds. The first thing I said was, they get more money? Because where I come from, if I do better, y'all should be kicking more stuff my way than everybody went silent. And we see that. We see that black private equity firms do much better than their white counterparts, but those black firms are basically capped or limited and never are able to get beyond a certain amount. We are used to having to do more with less and having to outperform. So just imagine when we actually get that real number, what in the hell we can do with it.
That's the whole point. And so the question is, how do we get started? How do we deliver on the promise? How do we then ask for what we deserve? And how do you demonstrate that this investment in HBCUs is going to be something that's going to produce returns in community, returns at the national level, returns in the civic infrastructure of every community that they touch, and drive our economy in a way that people never thought was possible.
So how are you tracking this in terms of how are you tracking the progress?
So one, we're clear that this is a long-term game. So we're investing through UNCF.
When we say long-term, 10, 20, 30?
We're on a 10-year trajectory with the first set of investments that are focused on the next 5 years, because we recognize this, we're in a crisis period. That's how we started. That with the impact of COVID and the heavy tuition dependence of schools, that we needed to do something to help make sure people were stable during this period. This next round of investment has been, okay, so what is the template that you can build by working with a set of institutions to say, okay, here's what it looks like to become more stable and transformation and align with where the economy is headed going forward, and what are the shared services and other things that can let many institutions benefit from the work of some. And then the third thing is, okay, now that we've got that, how are we investing in innovation at the next level to be able to serve more students, have more impact, and lean into the future even further to establish HBCUs as a sector, if you will, that's outperforming the rest of the sector. And then as you do that, you keep drawing in more resources along the way. First, investments that are just direct investments in the institutions, but then building these kind of endowments that we've talked about that allow you to sustain this work for the long term.
How do you also get those same people? Because this sort of thing happened in the charter school movement as well, where the funders were funding the same high-performing charters, but then you had your low-performing, the mid, that if they had the resources could go from mid to high, but everybody only wants focusing on these. And so when you talk about HBCUs, it's Hampton, it's Spelman, it's Howard, it's North Carolina A&T, it's Florida A&M, and then all of a sudden, so you have all of this focus sort of at the top, if you will, but then you still have those mid-sized schools and smaller schools. So how are you also encourage people to look at that?
So two things to it. One is I want to make sure that we don't think that just because those schools have gotten a little, that that's sufficient, because they are, standing tall in low grass right now. And what we need is for them to be able to stand up with endowments and resources and everything comparable to any other institution that performs at the levels that they do. So more resources for those schools and more resources for others. The way we approach that is you look at both performance and potential. And let me give you an example. So we went through the crisis management supports. That went to everybody. Like, help everybody you can get through the crisis, stay open, and get to the other side. Then it was, okay, well, how are we going to allocate intensive supports to schools and come up with these templates and shared services? So, of course, you look at, okay, so who actually is going to be able to leverage those resources and have an impact on more students right away? That gets you to a certain set of schools that are higher graduation rates, higher placement rates, et cetera, et cetera. But then, through the crisis management piece, you said, who executed? They're not performing very well right now, but who really executed during this period? Who made the hard decisions they needed to make? Who followed through on all the things they needed to follow through? Okay, how do we get them resources so that they can actually begin to capitalize on the opportunity for resources to perform at the next level, and they become the next pool? And then all of a sudden you've got a template for, okay, here's how you take a school that's already doing pretty well, and here's how you take a school that's on the come up and get them to the next level. And then out of that become tools and resources that you can share with lots of other schools. So, for example, lots of schools didn't have systems even to manage the information about their students and things like that. Creating a shared service around that relational management system is something that was able to be spread to 12 institutions within a year. And it can go further than that. So those are the kind of things that you can do right away. But the real question is, how do you get more capital in so you can get more resources to more schools along the way? Part of that is going to be about public dollars as well. So we had a great run this last period where we got not only some dollars to support students during the COVID crisis, but also we're able to have a huge impact, over $1 billion worth of debt reduction off the HBCU balance sheets. Those kind of things matter, but what really matters, because HBCUs are tuition dependent, are the policies that are going to continue to increase Pell and actually give more aid to students who are in need, which is the vast majority of students at our schools.
Final question for you, because really what this is about, and this is how I've said it, and I've had people, they try to fight me on this, but I don't really care. I am tired of us having survived conversations.
Yes.
Not just HBCUs, black newspapers, black-owned media, black organizations, black professional groups. It is a constant survive. What I'm saying is we should be moving from survive conversations to thriving conversations.
Correct. I agree 100%. And you talked earlier about the mindset, right? And there is a lot that HBCUs deserve because they've been treated unjustly over time. But the future is not about deserve. The future is about HBCUs produce disproportionate value.
Right.
And they have the potential to produce incredible value. That's a thriving conversation. The question is, well, how do you get there from here? And people want to be inspired about the possibilities, not feel guilty about what they didn't do before. So you can get a check when somebody feels bad about what didn't happen. You can get an investment when people think that the future is going to be something great. And when we make that shift so that the story that we are telling is not about what we are deserve, but what we can produce with what we are given, I believe it's going to shift the whole philanthropic landscape in terms of the kinds of folks who are willing to invest, the amounts they're willing to invest, and the patience they're willing to have about how long it takes to actually get to see what the promise is.
All right. Jim Shelton, always good to see you, man.
Same, man.
All right, then. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. We're going to do a quick photo, and then we are good. Antoine, just grab this for me. All right. Yeah, grab that for me. No, just grab this.